Hello, and welcome back to Missouri's Civil War. Last week, as I described how war finally came to Missouri, I said that Abraham Lincoln was determined to keep the border states within the Union. To do this, he was willing to conciliate conservative Unionists, including many loyal slaveholders. Other military leaders, including Winfield Scott and George McClellan, endorsed this policy of conciliation. But in time, as the Civil War dragged into its second, third, and then fourth years, Union commanders came to embrace a more forceful approach. It's one that historian Mark Grimsley has called hard war. This meant striking directly at civilian populations and at slavery itself in order to crush the ability and the willingness to fight on by rebels. Today we pick up our discussion after the Battle of Wilson's Creek by looking at the ways in which hard war threatened Missouri years before Union generals Philip Sheridan and William Tecumseh Sherman brought that approach to the Shenandoah Valley, Atlanta, and the Deep South. We will see this on opposite sides of the state. In St. Louis, Union General John C. Fremont's declaration of martial law showed a determination to punish traitors that was at odds with Lincoln's policy. The president concluded that Fremont's aggressive turn, particularly his attempt to emancipate Missouri slaves, was too much, too soon. Lastly, we will turn to the western side of the state, where a long-feared attack by Kansas forces finally materialized. This Jayhawker raid marked not only a dramatic escalation in the long-simmering border war, but it was also an attack upon slavery itself, and one that was Lincoln proved much less eager to restrain. Let's begin with Nathaniel Lyon and the Union troops. I'd said last time that they had further polarized a divided border state. The riot that followed their capture of Camp Jackson brought greater hostility toward federal authority amongst many Missourians. Many erstwhile Unionists who had once hoped that their state could indeed remain neutral, they shifted their sympathies toward the South. Federals still controlled St. Louis, but there were still many Confederate supporters in this highly charged city. In addition, reports suggested that guerrilla violence, especially against Union households, began to erupt across much of outstate Missouri. It was within this context that John C. Fremont became the commander of the Union Department of the West. Fremont's previous exploits had won him a reputation quite unlike that of any other political general. During the 1840s, his far-ranging explorations through the Rockies, all the way to California and the Pacific Northwest, had earned him fame as the Pathfinder of the West. And the work that Fremont did, building maps for the Army's Topographical Corps, if you ever look at them, just Google them. They're beautiful. They're really something to see. In 1856, this fame helped Fremont become the first presidential candidate of the new Republican Party. His wife, Jessie, was the daughter of Thomas Hart Benton, a towering figure within the Democratic Party in Missouri. His personality, John C. Fremont's personality, made him ill-suited to maintain control over this bitterly divided state. He was showy, he was vain, and he was fiercely ambitious. On August 14, 1861, General Fremont declared martial law in the city and the county of St. Louis. 2 weeks later, he extended this sweeping declaration to much of Missouri. His order stated that guerrillas caught behind Union lines would face the death penalty. In the suspension of civil authority, provost marshals now wielded tremendous power to police civilian affairs. The order also confiscated the property of known Confederates and, most notably, freed the slaves of disloyal Missourians. Not only was Fremont trying to suppress would-be guerrillas and their supporters, but he was also cultivating greater support amongst anti-slavery Missourians within the city. His efforts quickly drew censure from President Lincoln. This happens when you take bold action without first consulting your boss. The commander-in-chief wrote to Fremont privately that the proposed summary executions for guerrillas would surely invite retribution from rebel commanders. The Confederates would very certainly shoot our best men in their hands in retaliation, and so, man for man, indefinitely, said Lincoln. He saw an even greater danger in Fremont's emancipation order, which threatened, quote, to alarm our Southern Union friends and turn them against us, end quote. A significant number of Missouri's conditional unionists were loyal slaveholders. They were people who believed that the federal government and its tougher fugitive slave law from 1850, that would help protect their slave property. The president then requested, but did not order, Fremont to modify the proclamation to conform to an August 6th bill passed by Congress, which confiscated the property of Confederates being used directly to wage war, including slaves. I have to point out that by this early point, there was already strong support amongst Northern abolitionists to strike forcefully at slavery. Frederick Douglass, the great anti-slavery orator and activist, wrote, "To fight against slaveholders without fighting against slavery is but a half-hearted business. It paralyzes the hands engaged in it. Fire must be met with water." General Fremont refused to heed the president's suggestion that he amend the emancipation order, at least without a public command to that effect. Instead, John C. Fremont sent his wife, Jessie, to Washington to persuade Lincoln to reconsider. Jessie Benton Fremont then hurt her husband's standing even more by noting to the president that the general boasted greater wisdom and prestige. The day after her visit, Lincoln publicly ordered Fremont to modify the emancipation part of his order. Even though Fremont finally, and with some reluctance, agreed to withdraw emancipation from Missouri, such intransigence sealed his fate within the state. Some of his most important political supporters by now had long since abandoned him. These included the Blair family, who now worked actively to remove him from St. Louis. The provisional governor, Hamilton Gamble, spent much of this time shuttling between Jefferson City and St. Louis and Washington, D.C. He pressed federal leaders for greater aid and complained that Fremont's actions were likely to stir up greater violence, not to suppress it. And with liberal and conservative unionists lined up against him, it was only a matter of time before Fremont faced reassignment elsewhere. Fremont's short tenure as commander of the Western Department was an object lesson in how not to work effectively with your boss. He was hardly the only federal officer to turn toward martial law to subdue an increasingly chaotic situation. Such declarations would eventually become common in the border states. Nor was Fremont alone in choosing to deal harshly with slave owners. Ultimately, though, Fremont was undone by his obdurate pride and his determination to move faster than the president desired. Now, on the western border of Missouri, other Unionists showed a similar inclination toward hard war. In 1861, Kansas finally entered the Union as a free state, thanks largely to the withdrawal of so many Democratic senators from the South who had staunchly opposed its entry as a free state. And one of the first U.S. senators from Kansas was James Lane. The new senator quickly ingratiated himself to President Lincoln. In August 1861, Lane received permission from Secretary of War Simon Cameron to raise volunteer troops. Lane declined a military commission as a brigadier general because that meant he would have had to surrender his Senate seat. Weeks later, though, Lane returned to Kansas and promptly seized command of his forces anyway. He was not a man to be held back by these kinds of legal niceties. He deemed his men, quote, fit to play hell with Missouri, end quote. By now, years of irregular violence had destabilized the Kansas-Missouri line. Whereas Missourians were sharply divided in their loyalties, most Kansans had rallied behind the Union. In the summer of 1861, there was a marked rise in the frequency and the audacity of guerrilla raids on the border. After the Battle of Wilson's Creek, as Sterling Price's Missouri State Guard moved northward toward the Missouri River, Kansans feared that rebel troops intended to strike at their state, at Fort Scott or some other point across the state line. Jim Lane's volunteers clashed with the advancing guardsmen near Drywood Creek in Missouri, but they retreated back into Missouri, suffering only modest losses. Price continued northward toward his intended destination, the river town of Lexington. As the main body of rebel troops moved on, that skirmish at Drywood Creek stiffened Lane's resolve to punish Southern sympathizers within Missouri. On September 10th, exactly 1 month after Wilson's Creek, the Kansans crossed over the state line with a force of some 1,400 men, with the stated goal of clearing out the valley of the Osage. This Jayhawker Brigade attacked and burned the towns of West Point, Butler, and Morrisville. There they captured and executed several rebel recruits after a swift drumhead court-martial. Along the way, Lane's men plundered the farms of both suspected rebels and unoffending Unionists. One volunteer, Joseph Trago, said, "It does me good to use the luxuries of these fellows that have always been the enemies of anti-slavery men." No Missouri town suffered more than Osceola. The village, sitting on the Osage River, was the home of secessionist Senator Waldo P. Johnson and the site of a suspected Confederate arsenal. Guided eastward by a band of Unionist Missourians, these Kansans routed a small rebel force and killed perhaps a dozen men. Among their plunder in Osceola were horses, mules, brandy, coffee, flour, sugar, a piano, and several silk dresses for the general's own home. Some wagons were reportedly used to haul the dangerously thirsty soldiers too drunk to march back to Kansas on their own accord. In later years, Missouri guerrillas would point to this sack of Osceola as justification upon Lawrence and other Kansas towns. The most striking feature of Lane's brigade was a growing contingent of freed slaves who followed as they swept across Missouri. Traveling as far east as Springfield, the soldiers freed hundreds of African Americans. By November 1861, this so-called Black Brigade, led by chaplains A.H. Moore and H.D. Fisher, contained enough freed slaves to fill 160 wagons. With the barrier between bondage and freedom thrown open, many African Americans fled to safety across the state line in Kansas. Others remained with the troops throughout the duration of this expedition, finding work as cooks, teamsters, and servants. Jim Lane was an ambivalent liberator. Kansas troops, he explained, quote, "shall not become Negro thieves, nor shall they be prostituted into Negro catchers," end quote. The senator/general nonetheless saw that the seizure of such contraband, enemy property, could be at once a boon for his men and a hardship for their enemies. As a result, he concluded that, quote, "the confiscation of slaves and other property which can be made useful to the army should follow treason as the thunder peal follows the lightning flash," end quote. This Jayhawker raid triggered massive upheaval in western Missouri. Through 1860, the number of fugitive slaves escaping from Missouri, into Kansas had been perhaps a trickle. But by the fall of 1861, with the aid of these Unionists, that trickle grew into a stream and then to a swelling tide. For Missourians, Lane's raid represented the abolitionist invasion they had feared since 1854. Even some federal commanders worried that this turn toward emancipation carried serious political risks. Union General Henry Halleck, who commanded the Department of Missouri, believed that the Kansas raids aggravated anti-Union sentiments in Missouri. "The course pursued by those under Lane," Halleck wrote, "has turned against us many thousands who were formerly Union men." Some of the Jayhawking recruits, he said, were, quote, "no better than a band of robbers. They cross the line, rob, steal, plunder, and burn whatever they can lay their hands upon." Such protests reached the ears of the president. But in contrast to his swift reaction against Fremont, Lincoln did little to censure his Kansas ally. Quote, "I am sorry General Halleck is so unfavorably impressed with General Lane," end quote. Perhaps different challenges required different actions. Working in a large, divided, vital urban center, crafting a policy for an entire fractious state, these required a certain deftness that John C. Fremont did not possess. Dealing with a distant, more sparsely settled frontier, this offered to Jim Lane a bit more latitude. It became clear that by the fall of 1861, chaos was descending upon much of Missouri. As the Jayhawker Brigade withdrew, Pro-Confederate guerrillas in turn preyed upon Unionist households. The Unionist Home Guard of Cass County wrote to Jefferson City that rebel forces had begun to commit, quote, all manner of outrages upon the loyal citizens, end quotes. This deepening retaliatory violence was at once familiar. It was reminiscent of the long simmering dispute with Kansans, but now it was altogether worse, an internecine strife that showed no signs of abating. For next time, we turn our attention to the great rivers of Missouri and the campaigns to secure those vital lifelines. Until then.